Nothing is exploding anymore. Gas stopped surging. Headlines stopped screaming. Inflation, we're told, is cooling. But prices didn't go back. The grocery bill stabilized at a higher level. Household goods stopped rising and stayed expensive. What felt like a spike quietly became the baseline. This is the moment people mistake for resolution, because it looks calm, because nothing dramatic is happening. That's exactly how it looked before. After the first inflation wave fades, attention moves on. Markets adjust, consumers adapt, and underneath that calm, a different pressure starts to build. Not from demand, not from stimulus, but from policy decisions that barely make headlines anymore. Tariffs don't arrive with sirens. They don't show up as a sudden shock. They move slowly through supply chains, resetting costs, locking in higher prices, and changing what normal means. Most people won't connect the dots at first. They'll just notice that prices aren't falling, even when inflation supposedly is. This has happened before. The first wave creates the damage. The second wave makes it permanent. And as the U.S. moves forward, with tariffs quietly returning to the conversation, the conditions for that second wave are already forming. Not where people are looking, but where prices are set. Tariffs are usually framed as politics, trade disputes, negotiating leverage, protection for domestic industry. That framing misses what tariffs actually do. They function as a tax, not a tax collected at the register, but a tax embedded into costs long before a product reaches a shelf. When a tariff is imposed, no country writes a check. Supply chains do. Importers absorb it first. Manufacturers adjust next. Consumers pay last. This is why tariffs rarely look inflationary at the start. They don't arrive as a price shock. They arrive as a cost rerouting. Margins tighten. Contracts get renegotiated. Prices quietly reset upward. And once they reset, they almost never come back down. This is the critical misunderstanding. Tariffs are sold as temporary tools, but prices respond to them structurally. A tariff doesn't raise inflation all at once, it raises the floor. That's why tariffs don't fight inflation. They reroute it. Instead of showing up immediately in headline numbers, they disperse through categories, across quarters, and into what consumers start to accept as normal. By the time the effect becomes visible, the policy decision is already old news, and the price level has already moved. This distinction matters, because if inflation looks like it's cooling while tariffs are quietly returning, the next pressure won't come from demand overheating. It will come from costs that never reversed in the first place. From the surface, the picture looks reassuring. Headline inflation has slowed, energy prices stopped climbing, goods inflation eased. For many observers, that's the signal. The worst is behind us. The policy worked. The system absorbed the shock. This conclusion feels reasonable. Inflation is reported in averages. Month-over-month changes matter more than levels. And when the rate of increase slows, it feels like relief. But that's not how costs behave inside an economy. Prices don't reset because inflation decelerates. They reset only when pressure reverses. And tariffs don't show up where most people are looking. They don't arrive as a visible spike in CPI. They arrive inside input costs, contracts, and sourcing decisions. By the time tariffs affect headline numbers, they've already changed behavior upstream. Companies stop cutting prices. They stop passing savings through. They start protecting margins. This is why inflation can appear to cool while the price level quietly hardens. The public sees stabilization. Businesses see a new cost base. And once a higher cost base is accepted, prices don't need to rise for inflation to persist. They just need to stay where they are. That gap between falling inflation and sticky prices is where the next pressure builds. Because when policy adds cost at the base of the system, the effect doesn't fade, it waits. Tariffs don't raise prices where people expect. They don't hit the checkout line first. They enter far earlier, at the cost layer. A tariff is applied when goods cross a border, before retail, before marketing, before the final price is set. In the U.S., a large share of consumer goods still relies on imported inputs. Even products labeled domestic often depend on foreign components. When a tariff is added, companies face a choice. Absorb the cost, renegotiate supply, or pass it forward. In theory, competition should prevent pass-through. In practice, margins are already thin, so costs don't get absorbed. They get distributed. First into wholesale prices, then into contracts, then into what businesses quietly redefine as acceptable pricing. This is why tariffs rarely cause an immediate spike. They don't shock demand. They reshape cost structures. A higher input cost doesn't force an instant price hike. It removes the ability to cut prices later. Discounts disappear. Promotions shrink. Temporary increases become permanent. This is where inflation hides, not in sudden jumps, but in floors that never move back down. Once companies reset sourcing and pricing around higher costs, reversing becomes difficult. Even if tariffs are rolled back, the supply chain has already adapted. New suppliers are locked in. New contracts are signed. New prices become the reference point. This is why tariffs have a delayed effect. By the time they show up in official data, they've already done their work. They don't make inflation spike. They make it stick. And that's what sets the stage for a second wave, not louder than the first, but harder to unwind. Tariffs are often described as costs imposed on other countries. In reality, governments don't pay them. Exporters don't absorb them for long. Consumers do. Not all at once, and not always in obvious ways. At first, companies try to protect margins quietly. They reduce package sizes. They change materials. They shift sourcing. Prices don't jump. They creep. What looks like stability is adjustment. Over time, higher input costs spread beyond goods. Logistics gets more expensive. Insurance rises. Services reprice. Households don't feel this as a single increase. They feel it as erosion. The same income covers less. The same spending buys lower quality. The same lifestyle requires more trade-offs. This is why tariffs hit middle-income households hardest. They spend a larger share of income on goods and services that can't be deferred. They don't have pricing power. They don't get to pass costs forward. Governments collect the tariff revenue. Companies preserve margins where they can. Households absorb what's left. And because the increase is spread across categories, it rarely triggers backlash. There's no moment where prices suddenly spike. There's no clear line to point at. Just a steady decline in purchasing power. This is how tariffs change an economy. Not by collapsing demand, but by quietly reshaping what demand can afford. And once that adjustment is made, it doesn't reverse easily. Because even if tariffs are removed later, the higher cost structure remains. Consumers have already paid the price, slowly, quietly, and without a single headline marking the moment it happened. At this point, two paths emerge. The first is the optimistic one. Tariffs remain limited. Companies absorb what they can. Costs stabilize. In this view, the impact is contained, a one-time adjustment, a price level shift that fades into the background. Inflation stays lower. Policy stays restrictive. The system moves on. History offers moments where this happened. But those moments shared one condition. Cost pressure stopped expanding. The second path is quieter and more dangerous. Tariffs don't remain isolated. They tend to spread. One category becomes many. One policy becomes precedent. Temporary measures turn structural. In this scenario, costs keep resetting upward, not fast enough to trigger panic, but persistent enough to matter. Companies stop waiting for relief. They reprice permanently. They plan around higher costs. Inflation doesn't surge again, it hardens. That creates a problem policy can't easily solve. Interest rates fight demand. Tariffs raise costs, pulling in opposite directions. If tariffs expand while demand remains constrained, inflation doesn't disappear. It changes form. It becomes slower, stickier, more resistant to reversal. This is the fork cycles hinge on. Not a shock versus no shock, but containment versus continuation. If cost pressure pauses, the system adapts. If it compounds, inflation returns, not as a spike, but as a second wave built into the structure. Inflation rarely comes back the way it left. It doesn't surge, it settles. By the time people start noticing again, prices haven't jumped, they've stayed. Tariffs don't create panic. They create permanence. They reset what businesses consider normal. They change the baseline costs decisions are built on. Once that baseline moves, inflation no longer needs demand to return. It's already embedded. This is why the second wave is easy to miss. There's no headline moment, no obvious trigger, no single policy announcement to point at. The economy keeps functioning, jobs remain, markets adjust, life goes on. But purchasing power doesn't recover. Households adapt downward. Businesses lock in higher costs. Policymakers talk about progress, and the price level stays elevated. That's how inflation returns, not as a spike, but as a condition. If you're still waiting for prices to go back, you're waiting for something that rarely happens. Because when tariffs reshape costs, they don't just affect the present, they define what comes next. And that's why this period matters. Not because inflation is surging again, but because the structure that brings it back is already in place.